Well, that was Graham Stewart a little bit earlier on. Well, joining me now is the Labour Party Chair, Anneliese Dodds. Very good morning to you. Thanks so much for talking to us here this morning. So the government is deciding not to tell people to cut their energy use this winter. They essentially say it's up to them. What does Labour think?
Well, actually, we know that huge numbers of people have already cut their energy use. I mean, it's extraordinarily complacent, I have to say, to hear some of this discussion when already so many people have been forced to drastically cut back on their use of energy. Many families expecting that they will only be heating one room looking forward to winter. So that's already the reality for many families. And frankly, this is a damning indictment of Conservative policy over the last 12 years. We've not seen ultimately that gas storage being open. In fact, a lot of it has been closed during the period of Conservative-led governments. We've not seen the investment in energy efficiency. We've now got some of the coldest and draftiest homes in all of Europe in our country. Labour's been calling for a mass home insulation programme. No action, it seems, being taken in that direction. And I'm afraid it's just not true for the Conservative government to say that we have the right energy mix now. We've seen enormous delays on nuclear. We've seen huge blockages on homegrown renewables. Now, that's why Labour said we would be sprinting ahead instead, and why we'd have GB Energy to provide that green, cheaper energy for the future. So, really, this is an indication of government failure that we're even having these discussions right now about potential blackouts.
But I just wanted to ask you again about this question of telling people to cut their own energy. I mean, they did say that there's information out there on official websites that you can get tips on how to save energy if you want to. But they say, as far as energy security is concerned, it really wouldn't make much difference.
Well, actually, improving the energy efficiency of our homes would make a big difference, but that's not what it seems the government is focused on. They should be focused on improving insulation, for example. That would enable the creation of jobs up and down our countries. Labour set out exactly how we would deliver that. In fact, we've been calling for it for month upon month upon month, and still no action. I mean, the Green Homes Grant, for example, which was meant to be improving the energy efficiency and usage in British homes, is a complete failure, and nothing's been done to improve that situation. So I think we need to see action in that area. But I do think that the British public, when so many are already scaling back radically on their energy use, when they've been forced to do that because of the Conservatives' cost of living crisis, as well as the rising cost of energy, I think that would come across, frankly, as very patronising to those people.
So what would Labour do to ensure stability of energy supply? And the reason we're talking about this is National Grid has said in the absolute worst case scenario, there may be the prospect of planned blackouts in the country. What would Labour do to ensure stability of energy supply in the short term, this winter, next winter? What would they do?
Well, the first thing we would do is that mass home insulation programme. Keir Starmer called for that many, many months ago. That should be taking place right now. If we'd acted on home insulation, then the very fuel poorest households would not be as worried as they are right now about the prospect of a cold winter. Secondly, we would be acting right now to improve our energy supply. Again, Keir set out in his speech at this conference those measures up to 2030, some of them to be taken very, very speedily indeed, to be doing things like increasing those homegrown renewables. We know how to do this as a country. Just yesterday, in fact, I was visiting a facility where there's a huge, enormous battery going directly into the national grid, but it's one of just a small number of pilot projects. The time for pilots is beyond us. We should be acting now. And again, Labour set out those plans to act now. This is not only important for our energy supply, for preventing these potential challenges when it comes to blackouts, it's also very important for making sure our country has those jobs of the future in those green technologies of the future. And I'm afraid in both of those areas, the Conservatives have failed, while Labour has that plan, that green prosperity plan, to take our country forward.
But it's expensive, isn't it? I mean, Labour's talking about being an energy superpower by 2030. I mean, £28 billion each year on this plan to boost renewables and energy efficiency. How is that going to be paid for?
Well, actually, it's very important that we do act. And if we don't, it's going to be more expensive in the future. In terms of that £28 billion pledge we made that some time ago, we made that pledge because ultimately, unless we act, the costs for the future for our country will be astronomical. You know, the OBR, the Independent Fiscal Watchdog, it's made clear that if we put off this action for another 10 years, you know, we've had 12 years of drift. If we put off this action around the drive to net zero for another 10 years, they've said it's going to be twice as expensive for our country. But also, those renewable technologies are far cheaper when it comes to energy. It's far lower cost for consumers. That's why we should have been acting over the last 12 years. We haven't been. Labour set out that very clear plan for us to make sure that we get the benefit of those green technologies. You know, our country can be a world leader in them. We can make up those 12 lost years if we have that plan ultimately. But we do need to be acting on energy efficiency too. And that's why Labour's been calling for that mass home insulation that's so important. And frankly, if we don't do these things, the costs will just get more and more for families and for government.
OK, I just want to ask you about mortgage rates as well, because this week we've seen the average 2-year fixed rate mortgage rise to over 6% for the first time since 2008. What can be done to help people?
Well, the most important thing is that ultimately economic credibility has got to be re-established, because ultimately when we're seeing those increases in mortgage rates, that's been a direct result from the Conservatives' mini budget that they announced, obviously, some time ago. Now, Labour said that the government must come immediately back to Parliament. We've been calling for that for some time now. They need to reverse that mini budget. It is ultimately the cause of these increases in the cost of mortgages that we're seeing.
Sorry to interrupt, but if you say that the mini budget is the cause and unfunded tax cuts, why then is Labour adopting a lot of those tax cuts?
Well, actually, we're not. We've got a completely different approach when it comes to fiscal policy compared with the Conservatives. We've said that now is not the time to be, for example,
you're going ahead
cutting
with a 1p cut in basic rate of tax. Yeah, go on.
If I can just finish, I mean, they're cutting tax on luxury goods for tourists. They're going ahead with a corporation tax cut, you know, very, very significant in terms of the amount of money that would raise. They've got a windfall tax that's full of holes, that isn't backdated in the way that Labour has called for. And they're also, of course, not releasing the OBR's analysis, which is being provided to government today, which we believe probably would show the negative economic impact of all of these tax cuts, mainly for the wealthiest and for profit-making companies. And the government's refusing to release that analysis. Again, if they did release it, that could increase confidence too and help to get the cost of some of those mortgages in the future, at least, down. The government is not acting to increase economic credibility. It's Labour that's the party of economic credibility, and we need that change from the Conservatives as quickly as possible.